The anti-gunners are trying to ban our AR-15 semi-automatic rifles yet again, and I'm going to give you additional arguments as to why they simply cannot do that. Some arguments you're going to hear on this video that I'm not sure you've heard anywhere else. Stay tuned. We're going to go over it in a second. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Down, a proud American gun and a constitutional attorney, member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar, and New York Times bestselling author. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Down, our Second Amendment channel, please do so. Show your love for the four boxes of American liberty. This week, the anti-gunners in the Washington Post did a series of exposés and discussions, long articles, which I'll link to down below, about America's love of the AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. They tried to talk about the pros and the cons of this, but the truth is none of it actually matters. And that's what we're going to talk about on this video. And we're also going to give you some additional information that I've uncovered that actually shows why we're going to win in the courts to the extent the anti-gunners try to ban AR-15 rifles, or any semi-automatic rifles for that matter. To begin with, I want to remind you all that whether or not we as Americans need AR-15s is irrelevant. Now, of course, I think we do need AR-15s for a host of reasons, and I think they're very positive and good social influences for a whole host of reasons we don't need to get into on this particular video. But the point is whether or not we need them is not relevant. The question is whether or not we are entitled to have them under the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms, and the answer is undeniably yes for many reasons. But before we get into anything else, I want to say that when I say it doesn't matter whether or not we need AR-15s, that's not what I'm saying necessarily, although I do agree. It's what the United States Supreme Court has already said. You see, in the Heller case, which dealt with whether or not handguns could be banned under the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court itself says there's a bunch of reasons why someone might want a handgun, and then it goes through a list of these things. They talk about things like easy to store in a location, readily accessible in emergency, cannot be easily redirected or wrestled away by an attacker, easier to use for people without upper body strength, easier to aim the gun. So these are some of the discussions the Supreme Court mentioned in Heller in passing. But the fundamental point that the Supreme Court hit home on, and I want you to remember this, because this is the United States Supreme Court, it's not Mark Smith, although I agree with it. The Supreme Court said, quote, the following, in Heller, 2008, quote, whatever the reason, handguns are the most popular weapon chosen by Americans for self-defense in the home, and a complete prohibition of their use is invalid, period, close quote. Now, this is very important to understand because what the Supreme Court, again, is saying, whatever the reason is, it doesn't matter what the reason is. We don't care. U.S. Supreme Court doesn't care about why Americans choose handguns for self-defense, because as Americans get to choose what arms we get to protect ourselves and our family. It's up to we, the people, as to what arms we use to protect ourselves. And it doesn't matter if some platonic elite, some liberal politician in California doesn't agree with it, doesn't think we need it. It's totally irrelevant. Again, U.S. Supreme Court said exactly that in Heller. Whatever the reason, handguns are the most popular for self-defense in the home, and a complete prohibition on their use is invalid. So too, of course, that rationale applies to attempts to ban the AR-15. Because, again, the anti-gunners, as we saw in this Washington Post set of articles, are trying to talk about AR-15s and are they needed and all this kind of stuff. They talk about lots of stuff. Again, none of it matters. Americans choose to buy AR-15s because they want AR-15s for a whole host of lawful reasons. Self-defense, hunting, target shooting, fun, doesn't matter. It could also be collections. Put it on your wall. Any of these things are uses of the gun that are lawful, and therefore they are all permitted. We don't have to justify why we need something. It's the Bill of Rights, after all, not the Bill of Needs. Now, I also want to add, the anti-gunners have made a terrible mistake, in my view, this week with their Washington Post expose on AR-15s. Because the Washington Post, which is known by all, I don't think there's any shock here, as basically being pro-gun control. There's no shock. People know that. And the judges know that too in America. They're not stupid. So this is very important because the Washington Post has just reaffirmed other evidence that's already put in to the record in court cases and beyond that AR-15s are in common use. As you know, the Supreme Court has not defined the full scope of what arms are protected today or may be protected in the future because they don't need to. They don't need to. Why do I say that? Because by applying the in common use test, they resolve the issues that are pending today in 21st century America, right now. The two big ones are, can anti-gunners ban semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15? The answer is no, because those are in common use, because millions and millions and millions of Americans own these. So too, of course, with magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Millions and millions and millions of people own these as well. So these are clearly in common use. So the only thing that matters for our purposes is the in common use test, because we clearly win it. We don't have to talk about theoretical concepts down the road of other tests that might apply to other weapons down the road, because we're not fighting about those today. And who knows, we may never need to fight about them. We don't know. So let's talk quickly about the evidence of the AR-15. Then I'm going to give you some new information that I think our movement can use. We already know from studies like, for example, Georgetown professor Bill English. He concluded, according to a study which we've talked about before, there's approximately 24.6 million individuals who've owned an AR-15 or a similarly styled rifle. And he also assumes, his study or survey concluded that there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 415 million firearms, consisting of 171 million handguns and 146 million rifles and 98 million shotguns. Again, this is, I think, a few years old now, but you can see these are big numbers. All these things were in common use years ago, and those numbers have only increased. Beyond that, we know that the ATF has made public filings and official formal legal documents in their regulatory efforts. One of the things they said was the AR-15 type rifle is one of the most popular firearms in the United States. That is from none other than the ATF, the so-called gun experts, at least according to the government in the United States, have conceded that the AR-15 is one of the most popular firearms in the United States. That is a no-brainer. But let me continue on. This Washington Post set of articles actually reaffirms, and this is what I want to emphasize. The one thing I don't think our Second Amendment movement has done enough of, and I now want to flag this for you lawyers and law clerks and scholars and people involved in the Second Amendment, I want to flag something new for you. Because I just figured this out a few weeks ago, and I've been meaning to get to this, and now I am right here, right now. And that is, I've come up with a way to hoist the anti-gun movement on their own petard, which means to use these statements made by the anti-gun movement against them in the context of fighting over AR-15s. What do I mean by this? Specifically, I want to talk about how the statements made by the anti-gun communities about the robustness, the number of, the ubiquitousness of the AR-15 and semi-automatic rifles in America demonstrates they're in common use and simply cannot be banned. Let me give you a few quotes just from the Washington Post article this week, and then I'll give you a couple others from other liberal politicians after that. This is what the Washington Post said just this week in their article, big expose that can be cited to courts from the Washington Post. Quote, "Today, the AR-15 is the best-selling rifle in the United States. Industry figures indicate about 1 in 20 U.S. adults, or roughly 16 million people, own at least one AR-15, according to polling data from the Washington Post and Ipsos." That's the Washington Post, not Mark Smith, not the NRA, not some gun organization. No, this is from the Washington Post. It continues, quote, "Almost every major gun maker now produces its own version of the weapon. The modern AR-15 dominates the walls and websites of gun dealers," period, close quote. Again, it's in common use. It's ubiquitous. It can't be banned. It doesn't matter why it's out there. It is. Continue on, the Washington Post. Quote, "Today, the industry estimates that at least 20 million AR-15s are stored and stashed across the country," period, close quote. Washington Post just this week. Beyond that, quote, "More than 13.7 million of those have been manufactured by United States gun makers just since the Newtown massacre in late 2012, with those sales generating roughly $11 billion in revenue." Not a huge number in my view relative to other big industries, but set that issue aside. $11 billion in revenue according to a post-analysis of industry estimates through 2020, the most recently available data. In other words, at least 2/3 of these guns have been made in just the past decade. Again, these guns are in common use and becoming more and more popular. As the Supreme Court said about handguns in Heller, they simply cannot be banned. Carry on. This is also what the Washington Post said in its article. Quote, "The AR-15 seemed to be everywhere. Its cultural profile was rising, not unlike the way the Soviets made the Kalashnikov become a symbol of insurgency and freedom for many around the world." Again, the Washington Post. But remember, it's not just the Washington Post this week. That's just led me to realize we really need to go out, and you guys out there in the movement need to go find these statements made by anti-gun groups that say how ubiquitous, how AR-15 style firearms are everywhere, because all that goes into the legal record or to the scholarly record or to the legislative record or whatever you're talking about or whatever you're doing to show that these firearms are in common use, and under the Supreme Court standard of Heller, they cannot be banned, period, full stop. This is NBC News in 2017, for example, just to add on that this thing that I showed from the Washington Post this week is not new. It's been going on. The anti-gun, and I think NBC, which is part of the family of companies that involves MSNBC, this is what NBC said in 2017, quote, "Thanks to that ardent following and shrewd marketing," we're going to get to that in a second, by the way, and shrewd marketing, the AR-15 remains a jewel of the gun industry, the country's most popular rifle, irreversibly lodged into American culture, period, full stop. 2017 NBC says that the AR-15 remains the jewel of the gun industry, the country's most popular rifle, irreversibly, hear what I just said? Irreversibly lodged into America's culture. How much more in common use can you be than irreversibly lodged into American culture? Now, I want to address something in this because this is something that comes up a whole lot, and I want to nip this in the bud. And remember, I spent most of my career as a Wall Street lawyer. I have a lot of familiarity with industry and business and financial considerations. I used to run my own law firm, so I know a lot about businesses and how you run them for many reasons. Now, I want to talk about something that was said right here, right now by NBC. They say that one of the things that made the AR-15 is, quote unquote, shrewd marketing. Okay, I want to nip this in the bud right here and right now. Just because a business wants to sell a product or service doesn't mean anybody will want it, doesn't mean it will succeed, doesn't mean it will develop a brand following. For example, CNN Plus was launched as a streaming service. They spent a lot of money marketing it, talked all about it. Guess what? No one wanted it. It closed. How many Hollywood budgets for huge Hollywood films, are built up, marketed, pushed on the public, and collapse? Collapse. You would not have huge Hollywood failures of huge movies if it all turned on, quote unquote, shrewd marketing. The only reason a product or service succeeds is if there's demand for it in the public. You don't get to dictate your brand. What I mean by that is I can say whatever I want about what I want my brand to be, but at the end of the day, it's up to the marketplace. It's up to other consumers to dictate what my brand really is. What is the perception of me? My perception and my desire, how I want to be perceived in the marketplace, whether or not I want people, what I want people to buy my product for and why, that's fine, but it doesn't matter. It's all up to consumers. And if the gun industry made a crappy product that nobody wanted, it would not become a product that, quote unquote, has become irreversibly lodged into American culture. The reason why gun companies make these AR-15s is because Americans want to buy them. That is why Coca-Cola makes Coca-Cola products, because Americans want to buy them. That is why Amazon is successful, because Americans want the products and services that Amazon makes, perhaps with the exception of the Lord of the Rings, series, but set that issue aside. So you get the point. So when the anti-gunners talk about this is all about gun industry marketing to consumers, they're allowed to market to consumers. They're a lawful business. They can sell to consumers, but that's not what makes the AR-15 the most popular rifle in America. What makes the AR-15 the most popular rifle in America is that people want to buy it. People want the product. That's why it's so popular. That is a reason why it's in common use. Thrusting things into the marketplace doesn't make people want to buy it, and there's countless examples of this, which we've just gone over. So last but not least, I want to just quote a couple other things so you can see where I'm going with this notion, because you guys can do this at home and find other statements made by anti-gunners that we can use, again, as scholarship in court cases, whatever it is that you're doing out there in your op-eds talking about YouTube. It doesn't matter. The point is you can see what I'm talking about. So Eric Stallwell, the man from California. He made a comment about the federal assault weapons ban that he wants to bring back, of course. Stalwell said, quote, gun ownership runs so deep that we don't even know how many military-style semi-automatic rifles are in U.S. civilian hands. I think that's correct. They don't know, and I don't think they should know. They're not entitled to know who has these guns. I don't think that works. I think it violates the Second Amendment. But again, the point is that that's how ubiquitous these guns are, that people don't even know how many they are in America. But let's carry on. The National Education Association, one of the lobbying groups for the public school teachers and for public schools, said, quote, enacting the assault weapons ban is an important step in addressing the root of our national problem. There are too many military-style weapons on America's streets. Obviously, when they refer to military-style weapons, they're referring to AR-15s. They're pointing out, again, it's in common use, it's ubiquitous. And last but not least, the prominent left-leaning magazine, Mother Jones, said, quote, in other words, the real problem is that America has been saturated with far too many assault weapons, which obviously is a reference to the political propaganda term of AR-15s and other semi-automatic rifles. So the bottom line here is the U.S. Supreme Court says it doesn't matter why people want these products, these arms. They want AR-15s in the same way they wanted handguns in Heller. So it doesn't matter. So if you get into a debate on Twitter or anywhere else about why do we need these AR-15s, what's the purpose of them? Do they have any real value? None of it matters because the Supreme Court did none of that analysis in Heller when they just says, well, Americans like handguns and we're good with that. That's protected. That's all you need. And obviously we know that Americans love AR-15s. The anti-gunners have admitted this to us in addition to the other evidence that's out there in the public record. So obviously these are in common use, and because they're in common use, they certainly cannot be banned by government here in the United States. Okay, folks, I hope you learned a little bit something here about AR-15s and then in common use and some new additional evidence. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner channel, please do so, and we'll see you again here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.